Hey guys, Casey Ferris here. Thanks for checking out another video of mine here on YouTube. Today, we are going through Resolve 14, the release version. We're doing a huge crash course on this. It should take you from knowing zero about DaVinci Resolve to being able to open up the program and actually do something with it, which is what we all want. That's what we all want. Everyone wants that. Before we get started, just a quick note. I want to tell you guys that the reason we can offer videos like this and put time into it is just because of the support from you awesome people through Ground Control. If you don't know what Ground Control is, it's at groundcontrolcolor.com. We make color grading LUTs. We have all kinds of LUTs for drones and for specific cameras. And these are just to help your color grading game make things a little bit easier, make your workflow faster. And if you click on training, about halfway down, there's something called the Ultimate LUT Guide. This is pretty much the mother of all informational LUT posts. So if you want to learn how LUTs work, this is the place to go. It has a collection of a bunch of my YouTube tutorials. It has a bunch of information about how to use LUTs in any program, what's the best way to use them, and all about how they work. So if you're interested in LUTs, if you're interested in color grading, that's a great resource that we've made for you guys just to help you guys out. Another thing I want to mention real quick, if you like the way that I present things and this video is helpful for you, under this we have a link to our Teachable page, and this is an ever-growing list of courses that are hosted by yours truly. And I especially want to point out this one, which is the basics of color grading. So if you're new to color grading and you don't really know what you're doing with color, it takes you through the very basics of color grading, fixing white balance, fixing problems, doing all the fancy things that you might want to do inside of DaVinci Resolve. And it gives you a lot of the core concepts needed to actually match shots together and do creative looks and all of that stuff. And because you're a sweetie and you checked out this video, you can get 20% off of the Basics of Color Grading course if you use the coupon code BASICS20. So check that out. There's links under the training page at groundcontrolcolor.com. Let's get into it, shall we? I'm gonna open up DaVinci Resolve 14. Just a note, I'm using the studio version, which is the paid version, but I'm not going to show you anything that you can't do in the free version. Because if you don't know, the free version is freaking pure fire. It's awesome. Very, very powerful app and can certainly do professional work. All right, so when you open up Resolve 14, this is the very first thing that comes up. This is called your home page, and it shows all of your recent projects. For you, there might not be anything. I might just say untitled project. And so I'm just going to hit new project and call it something. I'll call it basics and hit create. So after you make your new project, brings up the interface. And just a note, I'm not going to go through every single button and slider and menu. I want to show you the most useful things that can actually get you going and working in this program, because I don't know about you, but I don't care about the fifth thing down in the workspace panel. I want to know how it actually affects my life. So that's the plan. I also wanted to mention throughout this whole thing that it's really important that you know what your settings for your project is. If you go down to the lower right-hand corner and click the settings cog, this will bring up the settings for your project. Make sure all of this is set the way you want before you start a project, because you can't change it once you add media. It's stupid. I know it's stupid, but that's a thing. So make sure that's set right, or else you might be getting yourself into trouble later. Resolve is broken into 5 different tabs, and these tabs have to do with pretty much your workflow in creating a project. The one that comes up by default is the Edit tab, which we'll talk about in a second, but starting at the left, there's the Media tab. This is where you're going to do things like import media, manage media, move things around in folders, preview stuff. There's tools for copying things off of hard drives and off of memory cards and all that stuff. This is kind of your media management place. Honestly, for most of your work, you're not going to be spending a lot of time here, because most of the stuff that you would have to do in the Media tab, you can actually do in the Edit tab now. That being said, there are a couple panels that you should probably know about. First of all, there's the Media Storage panel, which is up here. This is where all your hard drives are listed for your system. If you don't see them, hit this button right here. Almost all the panels have like a little list button up at the upper left. And so if you're wondering how to get back to a folder or up a level, or you need more options or something, click that little thing up there. And this is where you can navigate on your system to find media that you need. They have thumbnail mode and list mode. I usually go with list mode. And you can select media and it comes up here in the preview window. This is just looking at media that's on your system. It's not in your project yet. So if you want something to actually be imported into the project, you drag it down to here, which is called the media pool. The media pool is just where all the stuff lives in your project, okay? So let's say I want to import this shot of putting down the silverware, drag it into the media pool. then this little thing comes up and says, hey, you have a different frame rate for this video than you do for your project. And depending on what settings you want for your project, you'll either say, yes, change the project to be the settings for this clip, or no, leave the project as it is and just import the clip even though the settings don't match. And this clip happens to be at 60 frames a second at 1920 by 1080. And I don't want to work at 60 frames a second. I want to work at 24. So I'm going to say don't change. That's going to import it in my media pool. So that's like mostly what you use this tab for, is just importing media into your project. You can right click here and say add bin, and you can organize your footage into folders. And it kind of helps you to structure your project. Like I said, a lot of this is stuff that you can do in the Edit tab. This is more of just a specialized workspace that honestly kind of used to make a little bit more sense than it does now. But it's good that you understand at least these three windows: the media storage, the preview window, and the media pool. Now, if I switch over to the Edit tab, here I have my media pool. This is exactly the same as this media pool. It's just, on the side instead of down here. The one thing that's different is you don't have your media storage window, which is the one where you browse your system. The reason that doesn't matter that much is because you can open up a Finder window or an Explorer window and pretty much do the exact same stuff. Granted, it's a little bit harder to preview stuff, but if you're gonna import everything, you can just drag it into your media pool. So here we have the media pool. This is all of the media that's actually imported into our project. If we mouse over these, we have like a hover scrub thing, and it will scrub within the thumbnail, and it will also scrub on the preview window. So this is a really fast way to figure out what type of footage you have and kind of get it organized and pick the best shots to import into your timeline. Speaking of that, let's look at the rest of the Edit tab here. The Edit tab is where you're going to put together your edits. Makes sense, right? It's pretty much structured like any other NLE. There's your media pool, which is again all of the media that's in your project right now. There's the preview window. Down here is the timeline. So if I drag footage into the timeline, it will make a new sequence. And down here is where I do pretty much everything that's related to what you would traditionally think of as video editing. It's arranging clips in the timeline, it's cutting them up, moving things around. And if you've ever used any type of nonlinear editor, whether it's Premiere or Final Cut or Avid or Vegas, it works very, very similarly and you'll be right at home. It's actually laid out really nice. Up here is the program monitor. So this is what the viewer will actually see. So if I have a blank spot in the timeline, it's going to show me a blank spot there. Should be pretty straightforward if you have any experience editing videos. So a couple other important things for the interface. If I click up here, I can open my effects library, and there are quite a bit of really nice effects that you can do inside of Resolve. There's video transitions, there's titles, there's generators. There's also quite a bit of open effects, and there are quite a bit of Resolve effects that come with the free version. Again, I'm using the paid version, which has a few more fancy effects, but this is where those live in the edit page. You can also load third-party plugins if they support open FX. Also within the Edit tab, up here to the right, if you click Mixer, that will open up your audio mixer, and there you have quite a bit of control over your audio. And so if I have multiple tracks of audio, I can look at all my different channel strips here. I can resize my windows a little bit by hovering over this black line and moving that up. I can see a little bit more of my mixer. And we'll get into a little bit more audio stuff later, but in the mixer here, if you double click on this square, you can adjust the pan with this visual map thing, which is really nice. And of course you have your faders, your solo and mute, and it's all laid out really nicely. The other big panel for editing is the inspector panel. So if I just click on inspector up here, this is pretty much like the properties for anything that you have selected. So if you don't have anything selected, nothing's going to show up in the inspector. If I select this clip, it's going to bring up the properties of the clip here in the inspector. And there's two tabs. There's the video tab and the audio tab. Video, there's things like composite mode and opacity, transform controls so you can move things around. Something that I thought was really convenient and impressive is just a quick button to flip the image, which I haven't seen in any other NLE. I think that's pretty cool. There's cropping controls and some other things we don't probably need to get into right now. But just think about this panel as all the details for whatever you have selected. Same goes with the audio. There's volume, there's an EQ that you can apply to the clip, all built in by default, very convenient. So that's kind of the rundown. Let's take a look at actually building something that's watchable. So maybe we'll start out just building a sequence like this. Maybe I'll start with this wide of this table. I can scrub through this and hit I for in and O for out. And then I have a couple ways that I can put this into the timeline. I could just drag from the middle, and that's going to put the video and the audio into the timeline. Or if I mouse over this preview window, I have a film strip and a little audio waveform. If I grab the film strip, it's just the video, waveform is just the audio, and in the middle on the picture, it's both. This is pretty much how Premiere and Final Cut work, so that should be pretty familiar. So I'm gonna drag that down and suck it up to the beginning of the sequence. Now let's pick a different shot here. Now if I wanna bring this clip down into the timeline, I can also drag it on top of my program monitor. I have a lot of different options here. I'm not gonna go over all of these, but there are some pretty cool like time-saving things you can do by doing it this way. Things like if I hit insert, it's gonna put it in between two clips. Overwrite's gonna put it over whatever's in the timeline. Place on top puts it on the next track. It's just very well thought out. So if you get used to working this way, you can really assemble and edit quite quickly. So one thing I've noticed is that this footage is shot in 60 frames a second. And so we really want it to be slow motion. And I'm pretty sure all of this footage is like that. And so if you have footage like this that you want to work with and it's kind of slow motion, then you can right click on the clip inside of the media pool and you get this huge menu. But if you click clip attributes, then you can set all of the import settings for this footage. The most useful one being the video frame rate. So I can just select 23.976 for my video frame rate or whatever frame rate you're working with and hit OK. And now if I play this back, it's going to play back in slow motion, which is exactly what I want. So I can grab this and put this in the timeline and it looks nice. Now if I want all of my clips to be that same frame rate, I can select the end one and then shift select the first one, right click and go to clip attributes. And here it's going to ask what you want to make all the same. So if I click this little checkbox, it's going to say, okay, I'm going to apply this setting to every single clip, even if they have different settings. I'll say, okay, video frame rate, let's do 23.976 and hit okay. That'll probably mess with this clip since it's already in here, but it probably won't matter that much. Just grab this and put it back in the timeline. Now, as far as working with clips, if I drag this clip down to the timeline, I can play through it. That looks good. And let's say I want to cut it right there. There's a bunch of different ways that I can do this. Probably the simplest way is to grab the end and just roll it this way, and that's the end. I can also grab my blade tool and cut it right there on the playhead, go back to my selection mode and select this and delete it. But what I usually like to do is I like to use keyboard shortcuts. Let's say I want to cut this clip right here. I can hit Control / and that will split the clip at the playhead. And then I can delete it if I want to. If I want to go even faster than that, I can hit Control-Shift-Right bracket. And what that's going to do is cut this at the playhead, select this part, and delete it all in one stroke. Now watch. So Control-Shift-Right bracket, and that's doing all of that in one move. I can also tear off the front by Control-Shift-Left bracket. And so that's a very quick way to trim your clips in the timeline. Within the timeline, if I hit up and down, that will go to my different edits. Again, I can just drag this over and hit insert or overwrite, and that will put it right where the playhead is. And I can build my sequence just like I would in any editing program. So I'm going to trim this by hitting Control-Shift-Left bracket. Let's take a look at what we have. And we can continue to build our sequence. Another couple notes, if you hit this little button here, it gives you your timeline view options. You can adjust the height of the video and the audio tracks, tell it whether or not to show audio waveforms, and just kind of pick the display type of your clips, which is really useful, but kind of in a strange place. So just showing you that so you don't get lost. Okay, so let's say I want to zoom into this clip to get these light stands out of the way. With the clip selected and under my inspector, under zoom, I can just roll that up a little bit and I can reposition it using that control. Pretty darn simple. And I probably want the exact same settings for this end shot. So what I can do is right click on my first clip and say copy. And then my last clip, I'll right click and say paste attributes. And then it will ask me, goodness, there's a million attributes. What attributes would you like to paste? And I'll say definitely zoom and position. Let's go with that. And I'll hit apply. And that will be pretty much the same settings as the first clip. So that's a great way to copy and paste the same settings. One other thing I want to point out in the Edit tab is that you can actually animate things pretty darn easily. In the inspector, you'll see these little diamonds. Those are the keyframe toggle controls. And so let's say I want this to zoom out slightly throughout the duration of the clip. What I can do is go to the beginning of the clip and I'll hit this little diamond and I'll go to the end and hit the diamond again. If I have multiple keyframes, a little arrow appears here, so I can go in between the keyframes really, really easily. So at the beginning keyframe, let's say I want to zoom this up a little more. And then at the end, we'll have it out like that. So throughout the clip, it will animate in between those and zoom out. You can also get really, really detailed with this if you click the little curve button here inside of the clip, and you can adjust the value of those keyframes as well as how they're animated. So if I select this end keyframe, I can click this little button and it will ease into this keyframe. And you can see that with the animation curves here in the timeline. So the edit page is very, very detailed, very deep. And it's really like, Resolve pretty much just keeps adding features that are like features that would be in an entire app. So you can almost think of each of these as being their own app, especially Edit, Color, and Fairlight. So one last thing I want to do in the Edit tab is I want to add a title. Resolve actually has a pretty cool title tool, which I can open up in the effects library, and under titles, I can grab text and just drag that into my timeline. And that will make a new text title. And I can edit it just like a clip. I'll turn on snapping so I can snap it to the end. Here I can give it a name, do some hipster font. And there are a lot of controls that you can play with for your title. One of the coolest features, I think, is if you go to video, and this actually applies to any type of video in the timeline, whether it's footage or a title, and you can turn on this dynamic zoom, and it will automatically set this nice zoom out animation to your clips. And no matter what you do, like you can scale it up and it will still zoom out the same. It's a really, really convenient thing. So this I think will just keep simple. I can add my drop shadow and adjust that to taste. Another cool thing that I really like about the Edit tab is there are quick ways to fade things in and out. If I select this clip, this little white handle here, this is a quick fade. And so I can have it fade in and I can adjust the speed of it very easily right within the timeline without having to keyframe anything or without having to add a transition. It's just within the clip. Pretty nice. So there you go. There's a lot of stuff on the Edit tab. All right, so that's the Edit page. Let's check out the Color page. So as you may have guessed, editing is where you do all of your editing. Color is where you do all your color. So let's take a look at some of the layout here. In the Color tab, we don't have the media pool window because you would have brought your media in either the media or the Edit tabs. And now it's just time to work on some details about it. So right here we have the program monitor. This again is what the viewer will actually see. This is where you can preview your color grades. Below that is the clips timeline. This has a nice little thumbnail of each clip in the project. Below it is the mini timeline, which shows you pretty much a little squished down version of what's in the edit timeline. And below that are your detailed color controls. Up here on the left is your gallery. Up on the right is your nodes, and we'll get into those in a second. So before we get into all those details, I want to mention something from a workflow perspective. The clips that show up in the Color tab are based on what's in your timeline in the Edit tab. What's in your timeline in the Edit tab can be from building an edit from scratch like we have done so far in this lesson. And so if you're using Resolve as your end-to-end tool, like from very beginning of your edit to render, that's how you'll do it. But Resolve is a very, very powerful color correction program. So odds are you might just be here to color grade. So just for a second, I'm going to save this and open a new project. And I want to show you a way to import a project so that you can color it inside of Resolve. If you go up to File, you can say Import AAF EDL XML and select that. And you can import an XML that you've generated from Premiere or from Final Cut. And it pretty much imports your project into the timeline. A lot of people like working this way. I don't personally like working this way because it tends to be really problematic. Half the time it can't find the clips, or things come in at the wrong frame rate, or the timeline's messed up somehow. And so what I'll often do is render an ungraded version of my project out of Premiere and drag it into my media pool. I can right click in my media pool, go to Timelines, import preconformed EDL, and I can import an EDL that was generated from Premiere to bring in this footage and split it up into individual clips so that I can go over to my Color tab and do my color grades on individual clips. If you want more info on how to do that, check out this video up here. But the point I'm trying to make is that there are lots of ways to get your footage into Resolve, into the edit timeline, and opened up in the color panel so that you can do your color grading. I'm gonna switch back over to my other timeline, and let's take a look at how color grading works inside of Resolve. The first thing I'm gonna do is close a couple of these panels. I'm gonna close the timeline panel because I don't find it that useful. I'm also gonna close my gallery for now. So now I have my program monitor, my nodes, clips, and my color controls. Depending on the resolution of your monitor, some of these might be combined, like you might have all of these all kind of stacked into one panel. As far as I know, there's no way to actually change that. It's based on the resolution and the settings of your monitor, but everything works the same. You just might not be able to see things side by side like they're laid out here. So whatever clip you want to work on, you just select in the clips timeline. That'll bring it up so you can look at it. And then whatever changes you make to these controls will be applied to whatever clip is selected. So let's take a look at a few of the control panels here. The most common panel you'll probably be using is the color wheels. This is where you can adjust the lift, gamma, gain, and offset. The gain is the brighter parts of the image. So if I were to move this towards warm, the brighter things in the image would be warm. The gamma is like the midtones, and the lift is the darkest parts of the image. And so you have a lot of control over how your image looks with these three controls. The offset moves everything all at once. And I don't find myself using the offset that much. It's usually these three. So the color wheel changes the hue and saturation of those tones. And this little slider down here is the brightness. So if I wanted to make this really bright, I would just grab this little slider and drag to the right with my mouse. I can make the shadows darker by dragging to the left on the lift slider, and I can give it some nice contrast that way. So if you play around with these for a little bit, you'll get the hang of them. Down here below, we have a couple of controls over our whole image, like contrast. And if you double click on the label for each control, it'll reset it. Saturation, you can rotate the hue. And you'll see a 1 and 2 here if you click 2. There's a bunch more controls that I would recommend playing around with and seeing what they do, but this is like your go-to tool most of the time. There's also some cool stuff that they added recently. For instance, if you grab this little crosshair, you can pick your white point. And so I can click on something within the image that I want to be white, and it will set the brightness, hue, and saturation of that color to white and adjust everything else in the image accordingly. You can also do the same thing with the blacks. If I find something that's really dark that I want to be black, I can set that, and that can give you some good results. I can just boost the saturation and have a pretty good looking grade, honestly. Depending on the shot, this can either help you a lot or it can really mess you up. The automatic balancing and things like that don't always work exactly how you think they would. And I'm actually pretty happy with that. That looks pretty nice. And the good thing is, however it sets it, you can adjust it after the fact. Like let's say this black is a little bit too dark for me. I can roll up on my lift and adjust that, but it gives you a nice starting point. So that's the color wheels. The other panels behind the color wheels, you probably won't need right off the bat unless you're doing really specific stuff. If you have things that you shot in Camera Raw, like in DNG or Red, then you might go into Camera Raw and you have your Camera Raw settings there. But like 99% of the time, you'll just be working with color wheels. Over here, we have the curves panel, which is a very, very powerful panel. That gives you your standard curve, just like you would have in Photoshop or Premiere or After Effects. If you've done much image work, that should be really familiar. You'll notice there's a bunch of little dots here, and behind the dots, there's a bunch of other different types of curves. And these, again, will take some playing around with, but what's really cool is you can remap the colors in this image using these curves. For instance, hue versus saturation, you can pick certain colors within the image and saturate them more or less. So let's say I want to desaturate these hands. If I click on them with the eyedropper, you'll see it adds a point to my curve. And if I bring that down, that's going to desaturate those hands. And the cool thing about the curve is you can adjust how it bleeds into the other colors. And so you can be really, really specific about the type of effect you want. And there are similar things you can do with the other curves, like hue versus hue. If I want to pick this hue and change the hue of just specific colors. Behind the curves, we have the qualifier. And you can kind of think about this like a chroma key. So let's say I just want to select this color of the candles. I can click with my eyedropper, and that will set all of my sliders to select just that color. And I can see what color is selected by going to highlight mode, which is this little magic wand here. And I can see everything that's being selected, and I can adjust that selection using hue, saturation, and luminance to just select those candles. Then whatever adjustments that I make will just affect the candles. So that's really convenient if you're trying to affect a specific color and do quite a bit of work on part of the image. So that's the qualifier tab. That's like picking a part of the image to affect based on its color. Behind that, we have windows. Now, windows, think about those as kind of like a mask inside of After Effects. You're pretty much just selecting part of the shot based on where it is in the image, not so much the color information. So if I wanted to select this candle, I could click on my curve here and just draw a path around my candle. And we can see I have that selected. There's a bunch of different windows you can use. Here's a circle window. And since we have our highlight on, we can see that that's what's being affected. If I turn it off, We can see the whole image. And just like the qualifier, anything that I do is going to be applied just within that window. I can even add multiple windows to select multiple parts of the image. I'm gonna click this little circle thing to reset and reset my primaries. So the next panel over is the tracker panel. This, frankly, is freaking amazing, okay? And the most common thing you'll use this for is tracking windows. And so let's say I want to adjust the colors on this hand. I can draw a shape around the hand like this. Of course, you would take a lot more time and not draw it like some kind of weird Gumby hand or something. But there, I'm just selecting the hand, and just so we can see it, I'm gonna make it bright pink, okay? If I move around, we'll see that the hand comes in and out of that shape, which obviously looks horrible. What the tracker panel does is whatever window you have selected, you just hit play and it will track it. And I think that it might use actual black magic to make that happen, because it's silly how good this tracker is, you guys. I mean, this is kind of a wonky example, but I rarely have problems with the tracker not being able to track things. And the cool thing is, after I track, I can adjust my window and it will still stick to the track, because it's not keyframing the window, it's actually just applying the motion from the track to the window. And now it looks like he has a pink hand. If I soften this window a little bit, but despite the terrible job I did, it doesn't look that bad. With a little bit of adjustment, you could believe that this is a pink hand. So the windows and the tracker work really well together. And if you combine them with qualifiers, you can make really, really advanced selections and adjust different parts of your clip in a very, very powerful way. For instance, maybe we want to adjust the color of these hands. I can select the hands with a qualifier and then put a window on top of that to limit what the qualifier selects. And then I can adjust the hands by themselves and make scary pink hands. And with a little bit more refinement of that window, I can make it look like, I don't know, there's a purple monster inviting you to dinner. You know, useful stuff like that. So behind the tracker, we have the blur panel, which is used to obviously blur stuff or sharpen stuff, depending on if you roll up or down on this radius here. We have something called key and something called sizing. Sizing, it's good to know it's there because you can reposition things and adjust things within the color tab. And the key panel we might talk about in a few minutes. So that's kind of the middle section. And then over here we have the keyframes panel, which is where you can animate different things and set keyframes on different parts of your grade. I'm not gonna get too much into that. That works like most keyframing tools in most apps. Behind that, we have the color scopes. And these are actually really important. If you're doing color correction, it's important that you learn how to read scopes. There are a few different kinds. There's the parade, waveform, vector scope, and histogram. The ones that I use most of the time are the vector scope and the parade. The parade is almost the same thing as a waveform. And by the way, if you hit this little 4 arrow icon, that will pop out your scope so that you can put them on a different monitor if you want to, or you can just have them bigger. And there's all sorts of options for configuring how your scopes look. So I'm going to switch over to waveform. Pretty much how this works is this is a graph of the horizontal position of pixels in the shot versus their brightness. So up and down doesn't matter to the waveform, the brightness matters, and the position left and right matters. So as you can see, we have a lot of white things on the left side of the frame. Here on the waveform, we have a lot of spikes here, and that means that there are brighter things all over the left side of the frame. A parade is just a waveform, but with separate channels. So this is the red channel, green channel, and blue channel. The vector scope, I always like to turn up the brightness. You can click this little button in the upper right and boost up the brightness of the vector scope. Think of this as kind of a big version of one of these color wheels, and it maps all of the pixels in the image on this circular graph. If things are red, they're going to be pointed toward the red direction, and the more saturated they are, the farther they're going to get from the middle. If I had everything desaturated, if I brought saturation down, it's just going to hug the very middle of this graph. Distance from the middle is saturation, and direction is the hue. So just by looking at these two scopes, you can get a lot of information about what's going on in your image. So if I were to boost up my gain, bring down my lift a little bit, you can see that I have things touching the 0, which means there's stuff that's approaching black, and things that are up towards the top of the graph, which means they're approaching white. If I look over at the vector scope, I see it's not very saturated, so I can boost the saturation, and that's where we see that grow in the graph. So that's pretty much how all the color controls work. Now I want to talk about nodes. Now, nodes for people seem to be really scary, and I think that's because a lot of the programs we use work in layers, and nodes are weird and strange to us, and it gives us a strange feeling. We're in a strange headspace, but it's really not that hard. The idea is that a node is kind of a container of all of the corrections that you make. So all these corrections that we make, let's say we're going to make this bright orange, all of that lives in this first node, okay? And each shot has its own collection of nodes. And we can label these nodes, I'll call this orange, and I can add a new node by going up to nodes, add serial node, and that's going to make another node that comes after this node. Let's say this node, I'm going to label it desaturate, and I'm going to bring the saturation down. So what we're doing is we're making the image orange and then we're desaturating it. So this is just a group of corrections. And where these are on the node graph matters. The corrections flow from left to right. So this little green part is the starting image. So it looks like that. And then the end is what's rendered. So if I delete the second node, the starting image turns orange and then gets rendered. If I have the second node, it turns it orange and then desaturates it and then renders it. So it comes out black and white. If I were to change the order of this, I just select these lines and hit delete, and then do a reverse order and connect these up, it turns out orange. The reason is because it's desaturating it and then it's making it really orange. And there are a bunch of different types of nodes and like different ways that you can structure this. And I go over that in my nodes tutorial, which is right here. But for now, if you just know that all the corrections that you make down here live in a node and the order of the nodes matters, that's enough. So I'm going to reset this clip by right-clicking in the nodes and say reset all grades and nodes. And let's actually work on the color for one of these shots. I'm going to pick the last shot because I like it. And I'm going to start out by just making sure this is balanced, making sure it has good contrast and good saturation. So I'm going to take my gain and roll it up a little bit so that the white in the plates are nice and bright on my scopes here. And you can see a plate's here and a plate's here because they're on the left and right side and they're pretty bright. Left and right side, pretty bright. And I'll boost those up. Not too much like this, because then I'd be blowing it out, but a little bit closer to the top. And I think I'm going to bring the lift down a little bit just to have some nice contrast. And then I'm going to add some saturation just by rolling up in my saturation until I think it looks nice to my eye. Looks pretty good. I'm going to switch over to my parade, and I'm going to white balance to this plate and bowl right here, which if I open up my parade, I can see the bowl is on the right here, here, and here. And for this to be white, it's going to have a balanced signal between red, green, and blue. Because if it's equal parts red, green, and blue, that means it's white light. So I'm going to grab my gain, and I'm going to move it around and see what it does to my scopes. And I'm going to move it around until those parts balance out a little better. So right here, this little tip is balanced on that line. I can zoom out, and I have a pretty well balanced image with pretty good contrast and saturation. I'll close my clips so we can see what's going on a little easier. This is before, and this is after. So that's a good starting point. I'm going to right click and call this primary. And so that's like my first correction. Then I'm going to hit Alt S, which is the exact same thing as going up to nodes and hitting add serial node. And then after I make my primary correction, I want to do some more stuff to it. Let's say I want to add a vignette. I can go to my Windows tab and click on circle. That's going to add a circle to the middle. And notice how this isn't changing how the image looks right now. That's because this is in a new node and I'm not doing anything in this node. If I were to make it pink, then it would just make things pink after my first primary correction. So I'm going to position this and adjust it and adjust the feather so that it's around the whole image. Again, if I made this pink and switched off my Windows tab, we can see that I'm just affecting the middle and I'm making everything pink. Now, if I go to my Windows tab and I click this little thing right here, which looks like a circle inside of a box, that's going to invert my selection. And so I'm selecting just the outside instead of the inside. That's a nice little toggle. Now I can turn this off and I won't make it pink because that's weird. And I'm just going to roll down on my gamma slider a little bit, my gain slider maybe, and just darken the edges just a little bit. And let's look before and after. And I'm just clicking the number here on the node to enable it and disable it. So I can right click and call this vignette. I'm starting to structure my grade in different parts, and each part lives in its own node. The cool thing about that is if I make a new node, and let's say I want to add a really cool curve to it, maybe I'll switch to the red curve, and I'll give it kind of that green tinge like that. Then I have a fancy look. I'll call it fancy look. I could probably do all of this in my first node, but the cool thing about using multiple nodes like this is if I decide I want to go with a different look, I can just turn it off and I still have my initial correction here that I spent a lot of time on trying to get to look nice. So you're kind of building stuff in parts so that you have more flexibility to change things later. So that's the big deal with nodes. Now let's say I want to copy this look from this clip to all the other clips. The tendency is to want to select all of these and hit Control C, and then go to my next clip and hit Control V. The problem is it doesn't copy all of the nodes. It's just not how Resolve works. The easiest way to copy all the nodes, the whole look from one shot to another, is just to select the shot that you want to copy stuff to, and then mouse over the shot that you want to copy stuff from, and then middle button mouse click. And that will add all of the nodes and everything exactly like in this shot. If you're confused, like many people seem to be, about the middle button mouse click, or if you don't have a middle button on your mouse or you're on a laptop or whatever, you can also select a shot like this and then right click on a shot and then say apply grade, and that will do the same thing. But I would recommend spending $6 on Amazon and getting a 3-button mouse if you're going to work in Resolve, because the middle button it's the power, man. It's the Power Man 5000. Anyway, so then I can shift select all of my clips, middle button mouse click on all of them, and I can adjust them to where I like. This vignette might be too harsh for this shot, so I can adjust it. Same with this shot. And I can really quickly move through my timeline and apply this look to all of my shots. The other cool thing is I can turn off these later nodes and just work on my primary node and say, wow, I actually want this to be a little bit brighter. So I'll roll up in my gain and my gamma a little bit, and then I can apply that vignette and that fancy look again, and it will come out looking a lot better. One other note, if I like this fancy look but I don't want it to be quite as strong, I could go in and adjust my curve and make it less strong, but that would suck. So an easier way to dial things back as a whole is go to my key panel, and under key output, there's a number called gain. This is basically the opacity of that node. And so if I were to bring this down to 0, it's not affecting things at all. If it's at 0.5, that's like 50% opacity. And so what's cool is you can dial this in to taste once you have your really strong look, and you can dial down the opacity. Same thing with the vignette. If I don't want that as strong, I can dial that back using that key output. So there you go, that's the color tab. There's a lot of stuff there, but that should give you a great overview about how to color grade your project, no matter how you got your media into Resolve. Let's take a look at the Fairlight tab. This, like the other two tabs, is pretty much like its own freaking app. Like, it's a giant thing. And this is where you can do some very detailed work in the audio realm. And if you've ever worked in an app like Audition or Pro Tools or Logic, this is again going to be very familiar to you. Here we have the timeline where we can stack all of our tracks. We have some buttons here where we can open panels. Here's our mixer, which we'll get into in a second. We have a giant panel of audio meters. We have an inspector, which is like the exact same thing as the inspector in the Edit tab. We have metadata, which tells you all the nerdy things about your clips. Over on the left, we have our media pool, which works just like the media pool in the Edit tab or the Media tab. Our effects library, which is just like the effects library in the Edit tab, except for it's just for audio. You can load VSTs. I think you can also load audio unit plugins and apply them within the Fairlight tab. There's also the index panel, which lists all of your tracks, and it's a quick way to kind of sort things out. So if you just want to focus on like the first track, you can turn off the visibility of the other tracks and zoom this track up and be able to kind of focus on that. And as far as I know, this just affects the view. It doesn't like mute this in the final mix or anything. So it's just kind of hiding them so you can play with them in the UI. One of the first questions you might ask yourself is, where the heck is my video preview? If you click on meters, here it shows up on the right. You can also click on this little thing and it will pop it out. So you can have that available to watch through while you do your audio. Took me 900 hours to find that, but you guys are probably a lot smarter than me. So we're just gonna go with there it is. Couple of big things to note inside of the Fairlight tab. In your mixer, you have some built-in things that are really amazing. For instance, you can double click on this EQ, and this is a built-in equalizer for that track. You can do some really advanced EQ stuff in every single track without having to load an external plugin. It's just built right in, which is sick. Similarly, there's a dynamics panel, which has an expander, gate, compressor, limiter, and you can mess with this stuff to your heart's content to play with the dynamics of your audio. One of the things I find myself doing is if I have a dialogue track, I'll usually put this ratio up a little bit, bring my threshold down to like 16 or so, and then push up the makeup so that it makes the quieter things louder and the louder things quieter, and kind of balances out your audio a little bit and makes things a little bit more audible. These settings will depend on your recording levels and like a bunch of nerdy things, but that's just a quick tip. I usually run something like this on my dialogue track. And again, each track has one of these things that will apply to just the clips in that track. One cool thing about Fairlight is you can color code different clips to help organize yourself. And actually that works in the Edit tab as well. If you just right click and say Clip Color, it'll have common colors between the Edit and Fairlight tabs. Now, one thing that happens a lot is you'll notice if I hit spacebar, stuff don't play. It freaking doesn't play, okay? That's really frustrating. So how you fix that is if you go to your system settings, not in Resolve, I'm gonna go to Playback Devices, and whatever your playback device is, right click, hit Properties, under Advanced. Right now I have this at CD quality. If I switch it to 48 kilohertz, hit Apply, and then restart Resolve, if I hit play, it actually plays, and you should actually hear audio and stuff now. Of course, like an idiot, I don't have any audio in my timeline. So let's import some. Just drag it into my media pool. I can drag it into my timeline. There's our music. And a couple notes about working with things in the timeline inside of Fairlight. If you have a clip selected, you can hit Control / just like in the Edit tab and split your clip. And then you can move the clip around like you would expect you'd be able to. But something that I think is really cool, if I hit Control C, I can move my playhead around in my timeline and I get a little preview of what would happen if I pasted. So that's really convenient if you're trying to line things up. Like let's say I want to line up these beats. I just hit Control V and paste that there. And from what I understand, Fairlight is pretty much designed to be used like mostly with hardware and not really dragging stuff around with the mouse. So a lot of things are optimized to be able to move in between clips. Like if you have your track selected and you hit left and right, that's going to go in between your clips instead of like frame by frame. If you hit up and down, that's going to select different tracks. And so you can really quickly move through your project, and I can say cut this out by hitting Control X and then play. And then, yeah, I want it right there. Hit Control V and it will paste it in right there. So it's kind of a strange way to work, but once you get used to it, it feels really cool. And right now we're working in the like clip selection mode, but if you click over here, this is the range selection mode. And this is where you can click and drag and just kind of set ins and outs. And you can do the same thing. You can hit Control C and then play, hit Control V to move things around. And you can select things by hitting I and O, Control X to copy, and you can JKL and move that around in the timeline using just the keyboard, which is pretty cool. Hit Control V to paste again. So there's some basic things about editing in the Fairlight tab. And the final tab is the Deliver tab. And this is where you'll actually render out your project so people can see it. Let's say I have my edit perfect, my sound perfect, my color perfect. Everything I like is going on within this project. I can load it up in the Deliver tab and render it out for people to see. Here in the upper left, we have the render settings. This is where you'll do most of your work. We also have the clips panel and your timeline below that. Honestly, you probably won't use this part of it that much unless you're going to render just part of your project, where you could set like an in and an out down here and just render part of it. And then this little render thing says in and out range, or you can select the entire timeline, which is most of the time what I need to do, but you can probably just close the clips. And I like to hit this little arrow right here because it expands the render settings and moves the timeline over, because you don't really need the timeline, just saying. But like I said, almost everything is in the render settings. So there's a bunch of presets here. I'd recommend starting with one of these presets if you know what you're going to be doing. If you're going to be bringing your project back into another app, I'd recommend hitting Premiere or Final Cut and choosing a high quality codec. I personally like to work with Cineform, so I like to select GoPro Cineform YUV 10-bit because that's a nice 10-bit codec, very similar to ProRes. Select your resolution, your quality. There's some advanced settings here, which I'm not going to go over. You can look up how to do that, but this is where you set all your settings. We also have audio settings, as well as how to name your file. This part right here is really important because you can render this out as a single clip like its own movie, or you can render individual clips. Individual clips is cool because you can bring those all back into another timeline like inside of Premiere or Final Cut, and then you can have them all split up in individual clips, and whatever your workflow is, that might be helpful to you. I've definitely done projects where that's more advantageous, but most of the time I just hit single clip, just letting you know there is that option there. Once you have all your settings set, hit add to render queue. It's going to ask you where to put it. Pick a folder for it to go to, and it's going to add it to this little list over here. The cool thing is if you have a bunch of different timelines or a bunch of different like outputs or edits, you can add them all to this queue and hit start render, and then it can render for however long it needs to. It works a lot like Adobe Media Encoder or like Compressor, where you can add a bunch of different projects and timelines and then render them all at once. But once you have everything in your queue that you want, you can hit start render, and that will render out your movie for the world to see. It'll be glorious. Now, one more note before we wrap things up. This Deliver tab is the only way that you actually render video with your color grades and everything out of DaVinci Resolve. If you go up to File, Export Project, you surely would think that that's how you render things, but it's not. You only render things through Deliver. What Export Project does is it saves out your DaVinci Resolve project so that you can open it up on another system, or you can back it up. It's kind of like save as for your project. It's kind of weird naming, that's a thing. There's also a way of exporting a project, which is if you go back to your Edit tab, and then you go up to File, Export AAF or XML, you can export this project as an XML. And a lot of people ask me why that doesn't work. If they export an XML and then open it up in Final Cut or open it up in Premiere, why don't they have their color graded footage? And that's because they didn't go to Deliver and render all of their clips. Once you render all of your clips and it says you're good to go, then you can go back to your Edit tab and go File, Export XML, and it will link to all those graded clips. So for clarity, rendering video that you want people to see happens in the Deliver tab. Exporting projects to open up in different computers or different apps happens in the File menu. That's the difference. Goodness, that was a heap of things. I hope you guys had a good time. Resolve's an awesome app. Hope you guys learned a lot. If you have any questions or comments, leave them in the comments below. Again, if you want more training, go to groundcontrolcolor.com, click on training, and there's a whole bunch of resources there, including our ultimate LUT guide, as well as a link to our Teachable page with more advanced training. And remember, basics of color grading, you can get 20% off by using code BASICS20. You guys have been wonderful, I assume. I don't actually know because this is, it's recorded before you watch it. So I'm gonna assume that you paid really good attention and that you didn't talk and you brought plenty of snacks and you paused if you had to go to the bathroom. I'm gonna assume all that. Thank you guys so much for watching. My name is Casey Ferris. I will catch you next time.